The Week on Green 960.
And now, Sebastian Kunz.
Extreme Mammals. It's the new exhibit at the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park, and it just might change your perspective on exactly what makes up a mammal. To say nothing of what makes for an extreme mammal. When you think of a mammal, you think of animals that are warm-blooded, critters that give live birth instead of laying eggs, and creatures that use lungs to breathe air instead of gills. Doesn't sound too complicated or extreme, except for the exceptions. How about a mammal that actually does lay eggs? Dr. Carol Tang says there are still 2 species alive that do.
So here's the platypus and the echidna. Those are the 2 organisms that still lay eggs. And this was probably the ancestral form. And again, it kind of is a missing link in some ways because they have the traits of our ancestors, which is the bird and lizard lineage.
So what would cause such a strange thing? Mammals that lay eggs? Dr. Tang says it might be that bird and lizard lineage playing a role.
We think of mammals all giving live birth, and that's what makes a mammal. But here we actually have try to explore this idea that in mammals, in our sort of this branch of the family tree, there are egg-laying mammals. And they have fur and they have mammary glands, and they also have other features like 3 special ear bones that make them a mammal, and yet they lay eggs. And then, of course, we're familiar with the kangaroos and the koalas that don't lay eggs, but their babies are very, very immature and have to live in a pouch for a while before they can emerge out into nature. And so we have this variation and variety all within, again, one branch of the family tree of the mammals.
All kinds of things can contribute to the extremeness of mammals, including, of all things, something many humans think we've evolved beyond. Monogamy. Meet the Sengi. It looks a lot like a little field mouse. And frankly, it doesn't look all that exciting, but as Dr. Greg Farrington said, it's actually not a rodent at all. It's a mammal, and its closest relatives are even more surprising. They're a lot bigger than any mouse.
One of my favorite specimens in the exhibit is a small mammal called the Sengi, which is Swahili. When you look at the specimen, you'll be tempted to think it's a rodent or a shrew, but DNA, that great revealer of all, has shown that its closest living relatives include elephants, sea cows, and the famous Aardvark. I know most of your homes have a pet Aardvark, and so you'll be glad to know that it's related to the Sengi.
It's scientific surprises like that make this exhibit so fascinating. Dr. Farrington says the research is by no means finished.
There's a lot about this world we haven't discovered yet, and this institution is all about that and many other things, but exploring what we haven't discovered yet. In fact, Galen and his colleague Jack Dumbacher, whom you'll meet shortly, are heading to Namibia in just a few weeks, where they hope to discover some other new things, maybe another new species of Sengi.
So after our tour of the exhibit, a breathtaking treat for any science geek, we got to head downstairs through some passageways, under the academy, into the lab and cubicle area where the collections of items not on display to the general public are kept. It's a thick, heavily cemented bunker-type area, which the scientists say is no accident. Dr. Jack Dumbacher says it's built so that a fire can rage on the upper level for hours before any of the scientifically valuable items below ground would be threatened.
We have specimens that are well over 100 years old, and they look just like the ones that were collected last year. And if we take good care of them, they should last forever. So that makes these collections the most tangible and complete record of biodiversity on Earth. And they should last forever. So that's one of the jobs that museums do, and what most people don't even realize is that we're sort of the keepers of these records. And then you might ask, well, what's the point of having these records? But every specimen, you'll notice a tag on it, and it has the locality at which it was collected, the date at which it was collected, the person that collected it, and then all the biological material that goes with it. 100 years ago, when these first specimens were collected, nobody even knew what DNA was. And now we can go back to these specimens and extract DNA from these old skins that are 100 years old and use them in our modern studies. And we can look at changes over time or loss of genetic diversity because of bottlenecks or populations that went extinct.
Of course, laypersons might not fully appreciate what was inside the collections at first blush. As Dr. Farrington says, they look like mice. Kind of boring, actually. But as Dr. Galen Rathman says, just a couple of years ago, a new type of this animal, never before identified, was identified as something new.
These are the 3 traditional species of rhynchocyans, and we got this new one in Tanzania, and we brought it back and we compared it. We said, hey, this is really different. It's new, and so we describe it, and it's a new species. And the holotype, which is the specimen that represents all the traits of that species, is exceedingly valuable.
But why this need scientifically to label every subspecies? Dr. Jack Dumbacher says, perhaps surprisingly, one major reason is for conservation purposes.
The laws that we have only protect species, right? So if you haven't named it, if you haven't described it, then there's no law that protects it. And so from a conservation point of view, the only thing that's really protected are the things that have scientific names that are recognized by the scientific community. And so that's one issue. But important for all of our studies of biodiversity and for areas too, if we want to preserve a particular area or a park, the first thing that people look at is, well, how many unique species are there in that area? Or how much biodiversity is there? And the way that we measure biodiversity is by looking at species and subspecies and unique populations genetically.
And when it comes to the African Sengi, this mouse-like mammal, Dr. Rathman says one fascinating thing about them, as mentioned a moment ago, is that they are monogamous. In a way,
the best strategy in that situation for a male is to hang on to a female and make sure he fathers the young from that female. Now, the other strategy is to run around and try to mate with a lot of other females, but it could be because the females are well dispersed, he ends up with no young. Whereas if he sticks with that female, he knows he's the father and he will leave young. And this all has to do with evolution. And so the current theory for Sengis is that it's male mate guarding.
And when you look at other mammals, like dogs for instance, they're monogamous in a different way, and those differences have scientific validity too.
But it's male mate guarding is usually what's considered here, which is not the case in other monogamous systems, like a lot of the canids, the dog family. They tend to be monogamous, and usually the male provisions the young and the female. In other words, he has a role in raising the young, and if he's not there, the young don't survive. And that's a different kind of monogamy.
But it's not just about saber-toothed tiger skeletons and mousy mammal skins. How about an actual scientific missing link? Dr. Carol Tang says they have one of those too, actually related to whales of today.
And again, it is one of these really famous missing links that we predicted, but until it was found, it was really hard to actually prove.
Those are neck wrinkles and not gills, right?
Yes,
they breathe air. Yeah.
Yes, they breathe air. Right. In fact, whales do too, but they just have much more developed lungs. So in this case, it probably had to come up for air quite often, actually.
But all we know about this missing link species is some genetics, maybe some fossils. How do we really know that it looked like the educated guess artistic rendering that's on display to the public? Dr. Tang says we really don't, and that's part of the mystery.
One of the things I like to tell people when we look at these kinds of recreations, people are like, how do scientists know? And the thing is that all these recreations, just like the furry thing we saw in the beginning that Darwin had discovered the fossils of, is that these are just hypotheses. We don't really know exactly what the color is, what the color of the eyes were, exactly what its whiskers look like. But these are our best guesses based on what's alive today, based on the fossil evidence, based on comparisons and models. But I like to tell kids that, you know what, it could be purple. We have no scientific evidence one way or the other what it was until we find that pigment or the DNA or some other kinds of evidence. So anybody has a little bit of imagination, has an analytical mind, wants to think of things logically, they can be a scientist. They don't have to be one type of nerdy, math-loving, white lab coat-wearing person to be a scientist. All they have to be is smart and curious to be a good scientist.
Kids of all ages will be fascinated by the Extreme Mammals exhibit. It opens to the public today at the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park. Links to their website are on our website, green960.com, along with my exclusive video and pictures. Just head to green960.com and type in keyword the week. My thanks to Valerie Grant, Mark Van Gelder, Robert Costa, Jen Lloyd, Chris Mason, Corey Callawart, everyone assisting in the production of the week. If you have feedback or just want to see those mammal exhibit pictures and video, again, it's all up at green960.com. Just search for The Week. I'm Sebastian Kunz. Join me next week for the news of the week on The Week. This is Progressive Talk Green 960.